Hey guys, happy Wednesday. It's Mrs. Wendorf and my dog, Algie. I just want to let you know that this video will walk you through 1, the status of freedom in America before the Civil War, and 2, what was the cause of the Civil War. This video is hosted by other students and not me because that's fun. I hope you enjoy.
Hi guys, my name is Mila. Okay, so yesterday you guys defined the word freedom with either your discussion groups or on the forum linked through Classroom. Here are a couple of the definitions you guys come up with. Throughout this short unit on the Civil War, we will be asking ourselves the question, was the Civil War a war for freedom? The cool thing about that question is that there is no official answer. It's for you guys to decide as we learn about the war itself and its outcome. To give this more context, some of the other students are going to explain to you the areas in which America had freedom and was lacking in freedom before the Civil War started.
Hi, my name is Tana Long. I go to Judkins Middle School and I'm in Miss Wendorf's 4th period class. So I'm about to tell you about why America was lacking in freedom. Enslaved people and women could not vote, neither could Native Americans, and they weren't even considered citizens in the eyes of law enslaved people. Women and Native Americans were beneath white men. Masters could torture the people they enslaved, and enslaved people had no right to trial by jury.
Hi, I'm Claire Hannigan. I'm from Judkins Middle School and I'm in Miss Wendorf's 7th period social studies class. Some more ways that America was lacking in freedom was that enslaved people were treated like property and therefore they couldn't own anything for themselves. They also weren't paid for their labor. Free Black Americans and women could only work certain jobs with very low wages. Native Americans lost their property due to forced removal, as you probably remember from the Trail of Tears. Enslaved people were not allowed to travel or have families. Enslaved people, free Black people, Native Americans, immigrants, and women all suffered from discrimination. Finally, most southern states did not allow women or Black people to learn how to read.
Hi, I'm Kayla. I'm from Judkins and I'm in Miss Wendorf's 3rd period class. And here are some ways Americans had freedom. Basically, the only people that actually had freedom were white men. White women also had some freedoms. They were allowed to travel without their husbands at times, had education, and were allowed to work, but had very low wages. States had the right to decide whether or not they would legalize enslavement of other people.
Hey guys, it's Kaylani. We will revisit the information about the status of freedom in America later when you decide whether the Civil War was a war for freedom. Today we will ask ourselves, why was there a Civil War? In one word, the answer is slavery. Throughout this video, we will learn why the South's desire to protect the institution of slavery caused the Civil War. This may surprise you. Here's a video from the History Channel explaining the greatest myth of the Civil War.
The greatest myth that people have about the Civil War is that this was not a war about slavery for either side. In the case of the South and some of the Confederate heritage groups, you will see it argued that this war was not about the preservation or defense or protection of slavery. It was about the affirmation of states' rights or state sovereignty or a separate Southern culture.
Or it's about disputes over tariffs, over banking regulations, over the construction of railroads and other internal improvements, about taxation policy. That is, we find a lot of ways to say it's not about the institution of slavery.
The argument, unfortunately, is not that it was states' rights and slavery, that if it's states' rights, it's not about slavery. And that's been a constructed interpretation from the time Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens wrote their histories.
The reality is that the South went to war, the Confederate States went to war because they were trying to preserve their way of life. And that way of life was based on the institution of slavery.
So in that respect, slavery is at the core of the issues over which the war was fought for both sides.
It doesn't matter that not all Southerners were slaveholders. They had a stake in the society that they had created. Every white man, woman, and child benefited from the enslavement of African Americans. And from that perspective, many of them were willing to go to war to protect those interests.
And so the whole idea of having this myth created that somehow the South was fighting for an honorable cause, that started after the war as a justification for actions that were taken in many cases. In other cases, it's just human nature. You don't want to think that you fought so hard, that you lost so much, and that you weren't fighting for something that was honorable.
The main reason that the southern states seceded in 1860 and 1861 was because they saw Lincoln's election as a threat to the long-term survival of slavery and felt that they could no longer remain a part of the United States. And to say that it was only a peripheral issue for both sides is at best a half-truth and therefore a myth.
Here's a second video by Oversimplified History to give you more details about the cause of the war.
Not even 100 years after the Founding Fathers wrote, "All men are created equal," politicians were already asking, yeah, but what does that mean exactly? It means all men. Yeah, but what does that mean exactly? And not just that. States' rights versus the federal government. What are the executive powers of the president? Is cereal a soup? The Founding Fathers left some of these questions perhaps a little too open to interpretation. And the biggest question of them all was slavery. An ugly mark on what should have been a revolutionary new nation based on liberty and democracy. Thomas Jefferson had written a condemnation of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but out of fear of losing Southern states' support, it was removed. Hey guys, do you think leaving this a little vague will create any unforeseen problems in the future? Cannonball! And those unforeseen problems were now beginning to rear their ugly heads. As the nation developed, the North and the South developed along two very different lines, and two very different cultural identities emerged. Northern cities began rapidly industrializing, while the southern climate allowed for large plantations of labor-intensive crops. As a result, one half of the country didn't rely on slaves, while the other half had become economically dependent on them. In 1793, Eli Whitney's cotton gin caused the slave trade in the South to explode, while in the North, a growing abolitionist movement was taking root. A general mistrust began to develop between the North and the South, as Northerners felt the South were hell-bent on expanding slavery, and fear spread throughout the South that the North wanted to take their slaves away. In 1819, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. A perfect balance, a happy medium, a harmonious relationship. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm Missouri, and I would like to become the 23rd state. Hey buddy, welcome to the nation. We'll be happy to accept you as a free state. Oh no, you don't. You're trying to get one over on us. Missouri's gonna be a slave state. Okay, listen, why don't we just ask Missouri what it wants to be, and we slave state. Well, then, allow me to introduce to you the newest, freshest state on the scene, Maine. Hey, you can't do that, and you can't have any more slave states above this line. What? The issue of slavery is solved, and it will never come up again. A few years later, it came up again. You see, as America expanded westward, each new state or territory that was added threatened to upend the delicate balance between the slave and free states. If one faction managed to outnumber the other, it could gain an easy majority and force its own ideals on the opposing side, leaving a huge portion of the population feeling spiteful and oppressed. For a while, compromises kicked the can down the road and kept the volatile balance in check, as new free and slave states were roughly added in pairs. But then one loudmouth state just had to barge in and ruin everything as usual. The addition of Texas saw the United States enter into a war with Mexico, which they won, gaining a huge amount of land out west and creating even more problems. Hey guys, nice to meet you. I'm California, and I would like to become the 31st state. Hey buddy, welcome to the nation. We'll be happy to accept you as a southern slave state. Oh no, you don't. You're trying to get one over on us. California's gonna be a free state. Okay, listen, why don't we just ask California what it wants to be, and we can free state. Well, then, allow me to introduce to you the territories of New Mexico and Utah, able to freely vote for slavery themselves. Hey, you can't do that! And we can enter Northern Territory anytime we want to recapture escaped slaves. What? The issue of slavery is solved, and it will never come up again. A few years later, it came up again. In 1854, a Democratic senator from Illinois wanted to build a really cool choo-choo train here and proposed that the territories of Kansas and Nebraska be created open to slavery, even though they were clearly above the Missouri Compromise line. Obviously, the northern states were like, hell no. But the Southern Democrats who controlled Congress at the time were like, well, if you love liberty and democracy so much, then you should let them vote on whether slavery should be legal or not. And so it was. Huge numbers of pro- and anti-slavery settlers rushed to Kansas to sway the vote in their favor. And while they were all there, they began to beat the crap out of each other. One of those settlers was a man named John Brown, a former businessman who failed at just about everything he tried and went arguably insane. He was a radical abolitionist and dedicated much of his life to the Underground Railroad and freeing slaves. One night, in revenge for an earlier raid by pro-slavery forces, he and his sons killed a number of pro-slavery settlers in the territory, helping to kickstart years of violence known as Bleeding Kansas. Kansas and Nebraska both eventually voted in favor of outlawing slavery. But from here, the tension began to grow at a rapid pace. Now, within all this bitter debate over slavery, there were many nuances. North versus South, Republican versus Democrat, states versus the federal government. But let's strip all of that away. For 4 million individuals living in America, this wasn't about political intrigue or party alignment. It was about the basic human right to be free. Men, women, and children were stolen from their homelands and brought to the American continent, where for generations they were considered to be property, forced to live in poverty, and work from sunrise to sunset. Plantation overseers did whatever they felt was necessary to get the most out of their slaves. Punishments were often barbaric. Families were regularly separated, and parents could often only watch, as their children were auctioned off, never to be seen again. Thousands of slaves took the treacherous risk of running away, and abolitionists in the North helped many escape via the Underground Railroad, as bounty hunters entered the North to chase them down. Leading figures within the abolitionist movement included many significant free black men and women. Abraham Lincoln knew that slavery was a moral evil, and he regularly spoke out against it in powerful speeches that helped him rise through the ranks of the new Republican Party. He lamented at the hypocrisy of a great American nation meant to stand as a shining beacon of freedom, while also enslaving 4 million men, women, and children. He most famously declared in 1858 that a house divided against itself cannot stand, that one day, slavery in America would end. However, even Lincoln was cautious in his opposition. He didn't want to outlaw it entirely, but simply prevent its expansion, so that given enough time, he believed it would naturally die out. Thankfully, history would force his hand. In October 1859, one abolitionist decided he'd try to single-handedly take down slavery by force. Who would be crazy enough to even attempt such a thing? It's our good friend, John Brown. He planned to seize arms from an armory in the town of Harper's Ferry, free the slaves there, and continue south, inciting a major slave uprising along the way. A noble cause, a bad plan, and terrible execution. Brown's men took the armory and some hostages, but were quickly surrounded by one Robert E. Lee and his U.S. Marines. Brown was captured, and a couple of months later, he was executed for treason. Northerners sympathized with Brown, but Southerners were like, you see this? They're coming for us. Soon, there'll be 1 million John Browns. 1 million John Browns? Further fear began to spread in the South when news broke that a relatively unknown figure had just secured the Republican Party nomination for president. Abraham Lincoln, mostly well-liked among anti-slavery Northerners, had made some of the most powerfully worded speeches against slavery of any politician at the time. And now, there was a chance that he and his cheekbones could become president. For the South, that would be too much. In the 1860 election, Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. But much to their horror, when the final results came in, Lincoln had won by an electoral college landslide. Lincoln himself tried to calm their fear. How many times do I have to tell you, I'm not gonna take away your slaves? Yeah, right, Honest Abe. We've had enough of you Northerners. We're gonna go form our own country. South Carolina was the first to go, and over a period of 6 months, one by one, 11 slave states officially seceded from the Union, with just 4 contested border states opting to remain. The seceding states issued a number of official documents justifying their secession. South Carolina proclaimed that it was northern states' hostility to slavery that rendered the federal government illegitimate. Mississippi declared that their position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. And in a speech, the Confederate vice president stated that the new Confederate government rested upon what he called the great truth of racial inequality.
As you can see, each of the states who left the Union formally declare their reasoning was that they wanted to maintain their right to the institution of slavery. Tune into tomorrow's quick paradigm lesson to learn how the actual fighting started and when the war officially broke out during the first battle at Fort Sumter. I'm Kaylani. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I want you all to know that you guys are amazing and that you guys can do this.